Hello, kiddos. Miss Did It here. We're going to be continuing with Night Visitors, Chapter 15, A Sad Farewell. There was not much preparation to be done for the departure. Rebecca's family could not carry bags of clothing or bundles of food because such provisions would mark them as runaways. Packing too much would also slow them down on their journey to freedom. So they set off with only the clothes on their backs and some ham and biscuits. Once they left us, they might walk or they might be carried in a wagon. They might hop on a train and travel as passengers. They might ferry across a river or lake. Whatever route they took, it would be a long journey to Canada. They would have to travel north through Pennsylvania, across New York, and most likely pass by Niagara Falls before they crossed the border into Canada. As I thought about her trip, I became excited for Rebecca. She was about to have a new life in a new country. I hoped for her safe passage to Canada, but I was sorry to lose a friend. Would I ever see her again? I led her up to my room and we sat on the bed. I wanted to give her a gift, but I was uncertain as to what she might be able to carry. I said, "I want you to take something that will remind you of me." Then I looked at my book of fairy tales, the book we had spent many hours reading. I handed it to her. "Is it too much for you to carry?" She smiled. "If it weighed 100 pounds, I would carry it with me." I wrapped it in a brown cloth and tied it with a blue ribbon. I handed it to her. "Don't forget me." She took the bundle and asked, "How could I?" Then she put the book in a large pocket in the lining of her coat. We didn't have a chance to say anything else as Mr. Jeremiah called for us to come downstairs. We both clunked down the steps and saw everyone standing at the door. My father was handing our rubber coats to keep the rain and snow off their wool clothing. Then we walked outside and stood in the blustery weather. At least a foot of snow had already fallen, and more was coming. There was plenty of snow for snowshoeing, almost too much. I helped Rebecca strap on her snowshoes. Papa and Samuel helped Obie. With each passing moment, the storm got worse. The wind picked up and bits of sleet flew sideways, cutting my cheeks like knives. Obie struggled in the shoes, and I knew the conditions were too tough for them to get very far. My father said to Mr. Stevens, "It's too stormy to leave. Come back inside." "No," Mr. Stevens yelled over the wind. "We'll be discovered. They'll be coming tonight. Unless you can hide 5 of us, we must go." We all knew that the space in the bedroom would only hide 4 people, so the Turner family had to go north. Suddenly an idea hit me and I called out to Papa, "They can make it to the cave." "What cave?" my mother asked. Rebecca and I looked at one another. "There's a small cave about a 1/4 of a mile into the woods." "I think I know the one you mean," my father said. "It's between the stream and the large piling of rocks. Maggie and I found it. Rebecca and I have been playing house there. It's plenty big enough for the Turners and Mr. Stevens." "Can you get there by yourself in a storm?" Papa asked. "Gerald," my mother scolded, "not in this storm." "There are only 2 small pairs of snowshoes in the barn," my father said. "It'll have to be Amelia. Only she knows exactly where the cave is." I tried to convince my mother. "I can do it, Mother. I've been walking in the snow for days. I'm really strong. Besides, I know the shortest, fastest way to get to the cave. I could get there blindfolded." My mother put her hands on my shoulders. "All right, but please be careful." "Take Gus with you," Papa suggested. "He knows the way back home no matter where you go." I could tell by the look on my mother's face that she didn't want me to go, but she said nothing. I gave her a hug. "Don't worry, Mother." She hugged me and said, "I will worry, but you go and get back as fast as you can." Before she could change her mind, I strapped on my snowshoes and we walked toward the forest in single file. Obie followed me and Rebecca walked behind him. Rebecca's mother followed her, and Mr. Jeremiah and Mr. Stevens kept up the rear. The only one of our group that had no trouble making it through the snow seemed to be Gus. His long legs hopped in and out of the snow, the ice below it supporting his slight body. His breath was heavy, but he seemed to be smiling. Just looking at him gave me confidence. I took short steps so Obie could easily step into my tracks. He walked behind me like a little soldier. The wind wormed its way into my thick coat, so I pulled my wool scarf tighter around my neck. I looked back and saw Rebecca behind Obie. Soon I forgot the cold, concentrating instead on how well my snowshoes worked. There was a thin layer of ice below the snow, and it was frozen solid. My weight was equally carried on the strings and frames of the snowshoes. Each foot fell down an inch or two into the deep snow, then stopped. Still, it was hard work, and my face was soon red with the hard work of walking. Finally, the large collection of rocks was straight ahead, framed by the leafless trees around them. A lone cedar tree stood at the entrance of the cave. I walked steadily and slowly toward it. The snow died down until it disappeared altogether inside the opening. As the others caught up to me, I unstrapped my snowshoes. The next thing I had to do was to make sure some animal hadn't beaten us to the cave. Gus put my fears to rest as he slid inside, stood straight up, and wagged his tail. If there had been an animal inside, he would have known. I stooped down and tucked my head inside. My eyes adjusted to the lack of light, and I stared at the home Rebecca and I had made days before. The tablecloth and the flower vase were still there as we had left them. It was warm. Oh, it wasn't warm, but it would do. Moments later, Mr. Jeremiah, Miss Mary, and Mr. Stevens came inside. Miss Mary said simply, "We have stayed in much worse." Mr. Stevens looked at me sharply and said, "You best get back now." I paused, and Mr. Jeremiah said, "You're in enough danger as it is. Take your dog and go back home." "Won't you be cold tonight?" Miss Mary said kindly. "We've slept out during much colder nights than this," Rebecca said. "Besides, we have blankets." "But," I said, reluctant to leave them. Then Rebecca hugged me and said, "We'll see each other again, I promise." I looked at her and smiled. Then I hugged them all. I strapped on my snowshoes and climbed up the slope outside the cave. I dared not look back for fear that I wouldn't have the heart to return home. What would happen to them next? As I walked back toward the house, I realized that there were no snowshoe tracks to give away the escape. I stopped and watched the tracks I had just made. Within a minute, they were covered with a light dusting of snow. In 5 minutes, no one would know I had been there. The Turner family would be safe. I began walking faster and faster toward home. I was 10 feet away from the back door when I saw a group of men standing inside the front door. Before they saw me, I took off my snowshoes and hid them behind the well. I walked toward the house and recognized Rollins Mumford and the 4 slave catchers. I hopped up the front steps onto the porch and waited for the men to let me pass. Gus rushed past me and ran inside the house. I looked Mr. Mumford straight in the eye and he said, "Where have you been?" "Getting the dog inside. It's too cold for Gus to stay in the snow." Without giving me another thought, the men walked out the door. Their search for the family of 4 escaped slaves would continue. My heart swelled with pride that I had just helped them escape. Once the men were gone, my father closed the front door, and we all breathed sighs of relief. The Turner family was out of our hands now. They were once again passengers moving on the Underground Railroad. And that is the end of the book, Night Visitors. There is one additional chapter called an epilogue, and I will continue that in the next reading.